This story is not popular simply because it's a good story. It's the kind of tale that should never stop being told and never be forgotten. It's been shared in history articles, military blogs, documentaries, and even the silver screen. Because though this story may have been shared 100 times over, this story is rare. In an ocean of media sewage that is all too willing to drown you in exaggerated accounts of the heinous, the gruesome, and the criminal, the kind of account I'm about to share is an endangered species. It actually describes just how good human beings can be. It shows us the good things that we are all capable of, even in the worst conditions. It starts on December 7th, 1914, when Pope Benedict XV made an unusual request. It was modern humanity's first worldwide war, and modern humanity was trying to cope with the unanticipated destruction of its own inventions. The Pope asked European leaders if the guns may fall silent, at least upon the night the angels sang. In other words, let's have a temporary truce for Christmas Day. European leaders replied with a nonplussed no. Soldiers would be soldiers, even on Christmas. As December 25th approached, these soldiers were tasked with two priorities: to kill and to not be killed. They watched as their comrades were mutilated and destroyed just feet away from them. They had front row seats to a debut of deadly weapons the world had never seen before. To these men, many still very young, being human was much more grisly and dark than they could have imagined. To make matters worse, the soldiers had to combat much more than the enemy troops. Life in the trenches was soggy and infested with pests like rats and lice. In-trench toilets overflowed, and soldiers did what they could to avoid the duty of shoveling the subsequent mess. Flooding was a serious problem, especially when the ground had hardened and water pooled on the unforgiving clay. A whole medical condition was named after this lifestyle: trench foot. A soldier with trench foot might experience numbness, tingling, blotchiness, and blisters in the skin of his feet from soaking too long in damp conditions. Skin could dry and fall off. Permanent nerve damage could arise. Walking could become painfully impossible. And in the worst cases, trench feet had to be amputated. It was in these conditions that World War I soldiers struggled to celebrate the Christmas season. Christmas Eve was heralded by a chorus of war-haggard men singing carols. Had you been in one of the British trenches, you may have heard Silent Night rise from the mouths of your English comrades. If you were in a German trench, you'd likely hear the hymn in its original language. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. The words of the carols drifted from their respective ditches, wafted over no man's land, and intermingled with the voices of the opposing side. Night fell, and when daylight returned, the soldiers knew that Christmas had arrived. Then the drama started, with the Germans. A few of them had clambered out of their trench and broke the first rule of survival in World War I. In broad daylight, they entered no man's land and began crossing towards the Allied troops. Soldiers in the Allied trenches grasped their weapons warily. Some probably took aim, prepared for the worst. It's likely that periscopes were propped up against the wall, with anxious troops peeking through to analyze the approaching Germans. A startling observation broke out among the Allied soldiers. They're unarmed. As the German men grew closer, the Allied men were able to hear two words issuing again and again from the mouths of their enemies. They were spoken in somewhat clumsy English, but with a sincerity that translated perfectly. Merry Christmas. With some angst, the Allied troops observed these men, studying for signs of a ruse. Finally, they decided it was safe to emerge from their own trenches. They approached the Germans, and the mortal enemies shook hands in the middle of an active war zone. A Christmas celebration broke out. Troops emerged from either trench bearing gifts for men that had been doing their best to massacre them just days before. Things like cigarettes, sausages, chocolates, and plum pudding exchanged hands. Impossible photos were taken of soldiers from each side standing shoulder to shoulder, smiling. The Germans propped and lit Christmas trees around their trenches, and men from each country were joining together in song. They also gave a Christmas gift to their comrades who had been killed in battle by retrieving their bodies and giving them the dignity of a burial. There was one documented case of a rivalry breaking out among the truce keepers, a good-natured game of soccer. A British soldier by the name of George Ead had made friends with a German artilleryman that spoke good English. As this day, perhaps one of the most sacred Christmases of all time, drew to a close, his German friend said, "Today we have peace. Tomorrow you fight for your country. I fight for mine. Good luck." The men had to return to the trenches eventually. They were determined to keep the peace, at least till midnight. How marvelously wonderful, yet how strange it was, says German Lieutenant Kurt Ziemisch. The English officers felt the same way about it. Thus, Christmas, the celebration of love, managed to bring mortal enemies together as friends for a time. This unofficial Christmas truce was no small gesture. Men from both sides were risking everything to live the Christ-like spirit of the holiday. Everyone present had been trained to target, kill, and even despise the men on the other side of no man's land. At the time, their main purpose was to destroy the men across the field, and they had spent untold amounts of time killing the friends and comrades of the very men they had spent the day singing, shaking hands, and exchanging gifts with. But on that day, despite the trenches and weapons and fallen soldiers that riddled the earth they stood on, the Germans made a much bigger statement when they said a simple, "Merry Christmas." They were willing to see their enemies as fellow men. Men that were also missing their wives, their mothers, their children, and who believed wholeheartedly in the righteousness of their cause. Men that wanted to celebrate the birth of the same Christ that they worshipped. On Christmas of 1914, the Germans and the Allied troops were not men from the opposing sides. They were just people with a lot in common, celebrating a universal holiday together. Henry Willemason, a 19-year-old private, wrote the following letter and sent it home. Dear Mother, I am writing from the trenches. In my mouth is a pipe presented by the Princess Mary. In the pipe is tobacco. Of course, you say. But wait, in the pipe is German tobacco. Haha, you say, from a prisoner or found in a captured trench. Oh dear, no. From a German soldier. Yes, a live German soldier from his own trench. Yesterday, the British and Germans met and shook hands in the ground between the trenches, exchanged souvenirs and shook hands. Yes, all day, and as I write. Marvelous, isn't it?